Welcome, everyone. So
Thank
the
you.
mic, just so everyone is aware, the
you.
mic is purely for recording. We're recording this talk. So the mic
says
is not
no one's
amplifying in the
coming in
room,
the
so don't
next,
expect that to happen. It's not going to happen.
thank
So
you.
I'll speak as loudly as I can, but really I'm using this for the purpose of recording. And when we get to Q&A, which will be in the second half of our session today, I'm going to ask that everyone, before they ask a question, take the mic. Otherwise, it won't end up on our recording. We'll be able to hear it in the room, but otherwise it won't get anywhere. So please continue gathering food. Feel free to eat during the talk. This is a lunch session, which means eating is part of the plan. And get up and get more food as needed. So let me first welcome everyone here. Sorry for the doing the logistics before actually welcoming you. So welcome. My name is Greg Drinkwater. I'm the program director of the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative, which is a project of the Center for Jewish Studies, the sponsor of today's talk. And happy to talk more about my role and what the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative is with anyone who'd like to sit down with me and hear more. But in a nutshell, we help campus stakeholders, students, faculty, staff, administration, but also external campus stakeholders, better identify and respond to campus anti-Semitism, largely through an educational mission rather than an advocacy mission. As some of you may know, there are many advocacy organizations that work on issues of anti-Semitism generally and on campuses specifically. We focus from an educational role and therefore lean in more to nuance and complexity as good education really ought to do. Again, happy to talk more about that later. That's not really the reason why we're here, although it is a talk on anti-Semitism. It's not about me. So our speaker today is Anya Shternshis from the University of Toronto. I'm going to pull up my laptop so I have the full bio. So she's holds the J. Richard and Dorothy Schiff Chair in Jewish Studies and is also the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto and received her doctoral degree from Oxford. And she's written a number of critically acclaimed books, including Soviet and Kosher, Jewish Popular Culture in the Soviet Union, another book, When Sonia Met Boris, an oral history of Jewish life under Stalin, and most recently co-authored a book called Jews in the Soviet Union, A History, War, Conquest, and Catastrophe, 1939 to 1945. Her latest book, Jews in the Soviet Union, Post-War Life, Hopes and Fears, 1945 to 1953, is in preparation currently with NYU Press. Interestingly, because we often don't hear this about scholars, I'm now going to, with a little bit more enthusiasm, share the second part. Because we always get the long list of the books and the academic articles and the wonderful, smart, intellectual things they do. But Anna also has done something that I know very few people who have done. She created and directed a Grammy-nominated album and project called Yiddish Glory, which she co-created with artist Soy Korolenko. It's an initiative that brought back to life forgotten Yiddish music written during the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. And I've seen Anya and Soy perform music from Yiddish Glory. It's well worth your time. The album is easily available. Videos of their performances are easily available. Google is your friend. Last, I'm going to say that she's currently finishing a book tentatively titled Last Yiddish Heroes, a Lost and Found Archive of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union about Yiddish music created in Nazi-occupied Ukraine, which builds on the Yiddish Glory album. So now, hand it over to Anna, and I'm going to give you the mic because, again, needing to record sound. Oh, that's right, I forgot. You have a separate mic. So I will keep my mic here. Again, feel free to please get up as needed for food, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming here. And the topic I talk about is, what shall I say? It's not as exciting as Yiddish Glory performances, especially when there's no musician here. But, you know, I got, okay, so two things to say. First of all, thank you for inviting me, Greg, Ethan. Thank you for coming here, colleagues. Naomi canceled her meeting to be here, so I better deliver. And I got one very strict instruction from organizers. Do not talk more than 30 minutes. So I will do my best. I will start by saying that the talk, the idea of what to talk about and how to frame it came to me as I was actually finishing the proofs of my new book. I'm very excited about this now, about Soviet Jewish life in the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1953. And I've been writing this book for 10 years, and my biggest worry was that there is no way my readers in the United States and in Canada and the English-speaking world will understand what it is about. Because the reality I was describing of Soviet Jews living through Stalin's Soviet Union, experiencing discrimination, accusations and double loyalty, criminalized Zionism, thinking about using them as scapegoats for domestic and international problems that the country went through right after the end of World War II. That was another planet for my readers located in the United States. And I thought, okay, so my pitch will be that these are normal people living through extraordinary times. Well, because the book took forever to write, you know what I mean? Like a lot of things happened. And to sum up, I no longer have this problem. That is something that I think a lot about now. It does not make me happy to have a relevant study, but I want to share with you some of the themes that I think about that came up of that work, and also present it in some way for you to think with me on what happened. So this time in the Soviet Union from 1945, or more like from 1948 to 53, has been long referred by scholars, starting with this historian, Yeshua Gilboa, as Black Years of Soviet Jewry. Because this was the time when Soviet Jewry went through tremendous hardships. So right after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, and I'll come back to that in a second, what happened to Soviet Jews during this time, they came back to the country, and some of the darkest chapters of Soviet Jewish history happened then. For example, prominent Jewish intellectuals who survived the war, the only Jewish intellectuals in Europe who survived in Europe, were now harassed. A lot of them were arrested, and on August 12, 1952, cream of the crop of the Jewish intelligentsia, of Jewish writers, was shot. Another famous episode of that time is the doctor's plot, when the Jewish doctors were accused in poisoning Joseph Stalin. Some high-profile doctors were arrested as well. Doctors who were not such high profile during this time also experienced tons of problems. Their patients were afraid to come to them because they suspected that those doctors would hurt them because they're angry that their patients maybe are related to those people who collaborated during World War II and were killing Jews. So they were worried they will take a kid to a Jewish pediatrician, and the Jewish pediatrician will give them a vaccine that will kill or injure their child. They were worried that the medication that they prescribed will poison them. They were worried about surgeries. So there was this huge fear of going to see Jewish physicians. How it all ended was that Joseph Stalin died in March 1953. For the longest time, Jewish historiography and scholars based in Israel said that he died on Purim, but actually you can check the calendar. He did not die on Purim, but you get the sentiment. And a lot of things that were happening in the Soviet Union this time, like those campaigns, discriminatory practices, none of these stopped. Although the remnants remained as well. So what I just told you is a summary of how historians understood this time, the Black Years of Soviet Jewry. The problem with that approach to this time is that this assertion was based on the fact that historians were reading officially produced documents, archives created by the state, maybe memoirs and testimonies of people who managed to escape under very difficult conditions. But they actually did not talk to people who lived through 1945, 46, 48, 49, who were doctors, teachers, agricultural workers, accountants, and were living their normal life. And once we actually start talking to people, I myself have done an oral history project between 1999 and 2008, where I interviewed 474 people born in the Soviet Union before 1928. And I got them before Spielberg got them. So Spielberg Project Shoah Foundation also interviewed Soviet Jews, the Holocaust survivors, usually of that generation. And started this whole conversation. There are also materials of Blavatnik Archive, Fortunoff Archive, thousands and thousands of stories about what it was like to live through 1945 to 53 in the Soviet Union. And uniformly, interviewers ask people about difficulties, whereas people want to tell them about their families, their successes, their career highlights. And all these things happen during what we call the black years of Soviet Jewish history. So what I want to say with that is that when I was writing this study, I had to assert that what we imagine as black years, as the worst years in Soviet Jewish history, were actually a time when a lot of people felt lucky to be alive, were very felt that it's on them to be happy because so many of their family members were killed during the war. And they remember that time as the happiest time of their lives. So how do we reconcile this memory with some of the evidence that we have about history? And also, how do we think about this today? So I was thinking about two themes to raise in that conversation. And that is, these are the two trends that I observed, and I want to discuss a little bit more detail. So even though Soviet Jews lived normal lives during these times, most of them, they were, of course, aware of discriminatory campaigns and hostility in society. But they were deeply divided in how they made sense of it. So there was no one thing, there was never ever a moment in Soviet Jewish history that Soviet Jews had uniformed the same response to what was going on, with some very notable exception. And that exception is the doctor's plot. The doctor's plot with 1953 was the moment when Soviet Jews, no matter where they stood on creation of Israel, no matter where they stood on public Jewish culture versus Jews integrating into Soviet culture, the doctor's plot was the moment that there were no Jewish voices that somehow justified that. So the doctor's plot, according to my colleague, historian Elisa Ben-Porat, is a Soviet version of the blood libel. And historically, we know that Jews are divided along a lot of things. They're not divided on blood libel. There is no kind of way, there's no voice, Jewish voice, that would say, well, maybe sometimes they drink the blood. So I think that this, approach is useful to see, but on everything else, variety of opinion. The other thing, so deeply divided, and I will show some examples about that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is government policy towards the Jews and how so much of Soviet policies towards Jews were done on the premise of A, fighting against anti-Semitism, and helping Jews. And in the process, these fights divided the communities even more and ultimately hurt more Jews. So some examples of that. I have to start with the Russian Revolution, but I promise, I know my time limit. Actually, Greg, tell me when it's 12:35. So after the Russian Revolution, terrible violent time in the Soviet Union, people are living through very bloody revolution. The revolution meant that private property was outlawed, bank accounts confiscated, and tremendous violence erupted, and Jews were in the midst of it. So a number of reactions. The people with means who had money could leave Russia and run from the Russian Revolution. A lot of famous Yiddish writers like David Bergelson, for example, who later wrote a story called Among Refugees, went to Berlin because of Russian Revolution. Peretz Markish, not Jewish, but maybe still famous Russian, Vladimir Nabokov, also left Russia. We will count him as Jewish because his wife, Vera Slonim, was Jewish, so maybe a little bit of that. So anyway, so Irene Nemirovsky, a writer whose novel of was found in 1942 about Vichy France, the famous French writer. So all these people with means were able to escape Russia and run from Russian Revolution. The reason I'm bringing up non-Jews, the majority of them were not Jewish, but there were some very important Jews, and those who had means, who could run, they ran. A lot of people suffered from violence. So pogroms is probably the most famous Russian word, erupted. My colleague Jeffrey Weidlinger has written a very important book in the midst of civilized Europe, where he talks about how those pogroms of Russian Civil War were universally seen as the end of Jewish civilization in the Russian Empire. It's not just about murders, it's also sexual violence. In some areas, 80% of women were raped, and there were all these kids born a year later, 1919, 1920, with blue eyes, and there's a lot of rabbinical response on how to deal with those kids born outside of wedlock, out of rape. So we know how widespread all that was. And so Jews were living through this violence and destruction, all this. The Bolsheviks, when they came to power, however, announced one important thing. And they said to be anti-Semitic is against the law. And if a person does something anti-Semitic, if they say something anti-Semitic, or if they hit a Jew, they will go to jail. And they were enforcing those laws. So I wanted to show you. This is a picture of David Bergelson in Berlin. But what happened was that people took that stuff very seriously. Kornei Chukovsky, an important Russian writer, children's writer, wrote in his diary in 1923 that when people were afraid to say anything mildly constructed as anti-Jewish because they were worried about going to jail. For example, the Russian word for to wait is поджидать. The Russian word for a negative term for a Jew is Žid. So people were afraid to say the word поджидать because they were worried that they will be accused of anti-Semitism. This is what he wrote in his diary. Instead, they were saying подъевреивать, which in Russian actually sounds very negative towards Jews, but, like fighting against anti-Semitism that way. The laws were real, they were enforced. What was also real, that all restrictions that Jews had before the Russian Revolution were 100% removed. The Pale of Settlement where they lived disappeared. Restrictions of where they could study, where they could work also disappeared. And Jews took tremendous advantage of those social mobility. I put some statistics for you on a screen, maybe, in the middle of it, if you could see. Engineering schools, medical schools, just generally institutions of higher education were full with Jews. Another spaces that were full with Jews were places like Moscow, like Leningrad, that's how they renamed St. Petersburg, like Kiev, places that were outside of Pale of Settlement before. And those young people who left their homes in the former Pale of Settlement, often because it was destroyed, violence, often because they got those opportunities to study that they did not have before the revolution, they were very excited to embrace the Soviet project. So was community united in thinking how good it was to have all this access? Absolutely not. Why? Because these opportunities came with a cost, and that cost was one just had to abandon their religious observances. So, for example, you could not combine practicing laws of Judaism and being a student in a Soviet university. They did a lot of different things. Classes on Saturday, also no access to any kosher food, but also very targeted anti-religious propaganda against Judaism. All aspects of Jewish way of life, for example, observances of Shabbat, mikvah, circumcisions, celebration of holidays, every single one aspect of Jewish way of life was explained as this was hurtful to Jews. How? Shabbat candles so expensive. Why do you need to do Shabbat? It makes you poor. Mikvah, so dirty. Everyone gets syphilis who goes into mikvah. Syphilis, by the way, was a huge problem in early Soviet Russia because they also announced free love and there was all that stuff. So they were fighting against both in the same propaganda. So mikvah is bad for syphilis. Circumcision was also bad for syphilis because moles were sick and also bad for infection. So every aspect of Jewish life was fought like this through the system of state-sponsored Jewish education. So on paper, it looks like Soviet Union funded, fully funded Jewish schools for Jewish children. But in content, what they did for these schools, they created a system where they would destroy traditional Jewish way of life through through examples of through those postulates that they were teaching. So you don't need my explanation to know who exactly was designing those teaching materials. Those teaching materials did not come from outside. The deep knowledge of Jewish tradition, of concerns that people have, that problems that they didn't like, that came from disgruntled yeshiva students, from people who got Jewish educations, for people who wanted to use that knowledge in order to fight against the system which they hated. There's another example, Passover soon, so this is an example of Komsomol Haggadah, also written by Moshe Altshuler, not to confuse with Mordechai Altshuler, who's a historian of Soviet Jews. But again, he's trained to be a rabbi, and then he switched and he became the main Soviet apikoros. And by the way, apikoros, like a heretic, is a Yiddish and Hebrew word for somebody who fights against God, and this was a title. They had a militant godless league, and there was an apikoros division. There was also a journal called Apikoros and all this. So anyway, so that time from 1920s and 30s is the time that the community is divided into young, excited people who want to take advantage of social mobility and go study in big cities in Russia and abandon all these Jewish life, and older people, maybe people with less resources, maybe more religious people who don't think it's worth it. What does the government do? Incentive to study, yes, but also punishments for those who refuse to accept the Soviet way of life. Rabbis, some of the prominent ones, are arrested. The famous story of Rabbi Zhnerson, who had to leave, actually, Soviet Union. He went for Latvia and then later ended up in the United States. The movement and all this, the Chabad and all that, started from that story. A lot of religious people were arrested for other crimes. They were sent to jail for, for being corrupt or for doing illegal business and stuff like this. So if one looks just at the religious segment of former Pale of Settlement, how would you describe Soviet policy? Described as anti-Semitism. But if you look at all these Jewish engineers and doctors and accountants, it looks like a huge support for Jewish culture. Not only that, Soviets gave tons of incentives for Western Jews to come and work in the United States. The picture I put for you here is a photograph of Lina Stern, not only because Stern and Shternshis, I like that name, but Lina Stern was a physiologist who studied in Switzerland, and she was working on blood and relation to blood and quality and longevity. And, she had trouble finding resources for what she needed. Stalin's government gave her everything, the lab, resources, people, and she could start that scientific work as soon as she arrived to the Soviet Union. That happened in the 1930s. So, and by the way, the first woman to do this work, forget Jewish woman, like just the first woman to lead the lab in Europe at the time. So, okay, so I better speak really fast. Yeah, right, so once again, opportunities like that combined with repressions. So, community is divided. Religious community says, this is what will destroy us. Rabbinical leaders, maybe just people who live this traditional way of life, they think it's destroy us. The majority of Soviet Jews, however, believe that this is an opportunity. Now, I have to, and it worked. By 1939, 54% of Soviet Jews spoke Russian as their mother tongue. And those who kept speaking Yiddish were generally older and lived in western parts of the Soviet Union. 1939, Soviets annexed Poland, parts of Poland and Baltic states, receive about 2 million of non-Soviet Jews, And they're trying to do the same thing with them, arrest some, educate others as quickly as they can. But then 1941, a full-scale German invasion, and all that stops. So 2.5 million Jews that were murdered within the Soviet borders during World War II were mostly people from those newly annexed territories and older and so-called more Jewish Jews who lived in the older Soviet territories and the ones who didn't go to big cities. So after the war was finished, the Jews who survived were the most Soviet of all Soviet Jews. They were Russian-speaking. They were fully integrated in the Soviet economy. They survived because they were evacuated with the industry and worked for Soviet enterprise. And they thought of themselves as more Soviet than Jewish. Now comes the important part. When they came back after the war, they were grieving the losses. They were devastated about losing their families. Not unusual for one family to lose, 50, 60, 70 members. But they also were coming back from the place where they were equal citizens. And when they returned after the war, nobody treated them as equal citizens. A number of things happened. They were not allowed to come back to their apartments. Holocaust survivors, a few thousands of them who actually survived in the Soviet Union, were almost uniformly interrogated for surviving. They were suspected in collaborating with the Nazi occupiers, and that's why suspected in being disloyal to the Soviet regime. So, for example, 400 people who survived Vilna Ghetto were arrested and then sent to Gulag, usually on the premise of belonging to Zionist groups in the ghetto. There's a French historian, Alain Blum, who just found all this material in Soviet archives, and he creates those charts saying, well, these people were deported first by Stalin, then they survived ghetto maybe, and then they were deported by Stalin again. So it was not clear where more danger came to them, their way from Stalin or from Hitler or from both. And then everything began to change. So Soviet attitudes towards Jews was mildly confusing. 1947, United Nations starts discussion of creating a state of Israel. Against all expectations, Soviet Union votes for creation of the state of Israel. So in 1948, Andrei Gromyko, the prime minister, gives this long speech at United Nations. I think I brought you the text of that, saying Jews were persecuted, and now we're going to create a land for them. I mean, the fact that the Soviet officials said the word Jew out loud in this context, that itself was remarkable. NKVD, Soviet secret police, is not sleeping. They're writing down all the conversations that people are having about the state of Israel, and they keep reporting. Soviet Jews are too excited. They're too excited about the state of Israel. Itzhak Pfeffer, a Yiddish poet, who, when he heard about this, he said in a private conversation, of course reported also to Soviet secret police, they will never forgive us for this. And he was not wrong about that. Intellectuals worried there was too much excitement. Ilya Ehrenburg, a Soviet journalist who became super famous during World War II for writing an article called "Kill the German," where he said that one should not see Germans as humans. Anyway, he was of Jewish origin. He wrote this article in Pravda right after the state of Israel was established and confirmed by the Soviets. He told Soviet Jews, this is not for you. Israel is for all these Polish Jews, for all these people who have nowhere to go. Soviet Jews have their motherland here. Don't get too excited. Ilya Ehrenburg's article was condemned by the Jewish population. People called him self-hating Jew. They called him an enemy of Jewish people. They called him worse than Hitler. Why? Because how could he not support the initiative that people longed for so long? Well, sure enough, very soon after the State of Israel was established, a lot of things happened. They happened in the art world. Literary critics Jews were very well represented among artists, literary critics, theater critics, celebrities. the conversation began. There are too many Jews everywhere. Why do we have so many Jews everywhere? They're like everywhere, all the positions of power. And they are, how do we call them today? Gatekeepers. Gatekeepers from true, authentic Russian voices to get into our arts. It's impossible to get through that Jewish lobby, for this Jewish mafia. The government launched an anti-cosmopolitan campaign that fought against those rootlessness, against those double loyalties. Arrests began, but those arrests were kept secret. Like all these Yiddish writers were arrested. Solomon Michoels, the Soviet Yiddish theater director, was killed, and then. But all that was quiet. What was not quiet is attack on art, literature, and theater. Then they came for science. So first they came for genetics. Genetics was announced to be, that's not a Soviet art. That's not a Soviet science, because genetics talks about people being born with stuff. We believe that people could be raised according to ideology. And if you raise them right, that will happen. So the entire field of genetic molecular biology and genetics was shut down very quickly. Then they started attacking physics. The whole tropes of physics being Jewish science emerged. Theoretical physics especially, not so much practical physics, experimental physics, because they were building nuclear bombs, so they didn't touch that, but theoretical physics for sure. Lev Landau, one of the most famous Soviet theoretical physicists, was fired from his position in 1948. 1947, by the way, he got a Stalin's prize. In 1962, he got a Nobel Prize. But during this time, he could not work on his research. That sounds super anti-Semitic. And at the same time, Lazar Kaganovich is a very high-powered politician in the Soviet government, one of the closest allies to Stalin. One of the most famous artists in the Soviet Union is Leonid Utesov, unapologetically Jewish. So the community is once again divided. If only you behave well, if only you don't call for Israel to be established, if only you don't call for Jewish public culture, if only you don't call for all that, then you will be okay and you will succeed and thrive in the Soviet regime. Then comes the doctor's plot, and that, as I said, of course, undivided the community. So the conclusions that I have come in forms of questions. Historians have been debating for a long time, why did it happen? Why did Stalin, who benefited so much from Jews being so loyal, why did he change the policies? So I'll tell you 4 versions. One, Stalin was an anti-Semite. I think that version could be more or less thrown out, because even if he was, it's irrelevant, right? Because his personal views did not actually matter, because the policies were so different in the 30s and 40s. The second version is Jews were punished, Soviet Jews, for creation of Israel, because then they showed double loyalty. That version may be okay, but I think it's also too simplistic and maybe wrong. The third version is that Soviet population, Soviet people, actually integrated quite a bit of Nazi ideology against Jews during the war. It was not unpopular, killing, repression, getting rid of Jews, and they internalized a lot of that messaging. So after the war, this was a populist measure, something that responded. I think that version gets a B+. And then the fourth version, which I think is more likely, so I gave it away, is that campaign and all this uncertainty and division of community truly distracted Soviet people, both Jews and non-Jews, from the issues they were facing. Economic destruction, lack of ideological conviction. There were a lot of questions. Why did we fight the war? Why did we fight the war the way we did? Why did so many people die? Why did all these people in the West live so much better than us? All the soldiers came back. The society was not happy with Stalin. And that kind of populist measure, attacking Jews, was a time-tested way to deal with them. And once again, some believed in it or not. How does the story end? Well, in my story, Stalin died in 1953. The hostility towards Jews and the glass ceilings and restrictions and all this lasted more or less until 1989. Then, 1989, relaxation, 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. Being Jewish became a good thing. It became actually an asset. The joke circulated saying, Jewish wife is not a luxury, but a mean of transportation, because it was about immigration for Jews that was allowed to United States and to Israel and all this. So from 1989 up until, today, we're looking at the situation where there is no documented restrictions of hostility against Jews. So there's no criminalization of Zionism, there is no euphemism calling Jews cosmopolitans, only in the joke sometimes. But now we also see it changing. And it is possible, it's been 36 years. Now there is a Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now there's a lot of discussion about Jewishness of Zelensky and Jewish advisors of Putin. And it looks like that golden age of now 40 years, when Jews actually were equal citizens with no kind of special story to tell, is going to change. But on that, I'm going to talk at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., whatever my talk is. So I'm going to finish here, and thank you for your attention.
All right, so folks, unfortunately, this room is reserved for another group at once. We are going to only have about 15 minutes for questions, so I apologize for that in advance. So I'm going to ask it when you do have a question, that it A, be a question, and B, that it be very, very brief, so that we leave space for Anna to be able to answer. So with that said, questions, and then remember, we'll need to use the mic. And particularly any students with questions. We always like to give a first question to students if they have some.
If you don't have questions, I'll speak for another 20 minutes. I'm just saying, just warning.
All right, I'll start off with a question, which is one topic that you haven't addressed, and maybe this was because of time, but the extent to which there are arguments about anti-Zionist politics currently in the US and around the globe having some deep ties to Soviet anti-Zionism, and some people make arguments that those are very direct ties and some less so. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So again, it's interesting how you look, right? If you look at rhetoric of anti-Zionist sentiment today and then, things look a lot very similar. It's about oppressing other people. It's about colonizing the land that's not yours, Jews taking too much power, Zionists disregarding everyone else only to benefit themselves. Also a lot of discussion about Jewish power standing behind Zionists. So all that is word by word Soviet stuff from the 60s and 70s and from popular literature. And to make it even worse, so much of that stuff was written by journalists and writers who were collaborating with Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. This famous book called Judaism Without Beautification was written by Klitschko, by a person who was working as a writer for Nazi Germany when Kiev was occupied by Germans. So looks very bad, right? Looks very, very bad. But I don't make those, I think comparison of those tropes with what's going on now is actually not super helpful. Because, like you're going to critique Zionism, like how many things can you find to critique? So they will be similar. But the big difference between the Soviet case and maybe some of the sentiment now is that in the Soviet case, majority of it, if not all of it, came from above. That came from government-funded writers, directives saying we have to complain about this, and this is how you complain, this is what you say, and all this. What we see today in a rhetoric of anti-Zionism and thinking about the moral and problems with this and all that, that is grassroots. That does not come. People are internalizing that language, and if anything, if you compare, say, Soviet universities, they would tell students, you have to remember, you have to write down and take a test on anti-Zionism, how wrong it is. it came from above. In today's world, it definitely does not come from above. It comes from grassroots. You look at your street signs, you look at your discussion, you look at meetings. People genuinely, believe these sentiments about the nature of Zionism. So it's very tempting to dismiss all the critique by saying, oh, it's like Soviets and Soviets is all made up. Whereas the practice of how it's happening here, and by say here, I mean, I know a lot more about Canada, almost nothing about the US, but I think it's similar. It does not come from above. It does not come from above.
Questions?
So I wanted to ask about the anti-Zionist sentiment in 1947, 1948, around the time of Nation of Israel, and how did that rationale coincide with the Jewish autonomous region?
Forgot about Jewish autonomous region. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Did you finish your question, or you have?
I was just wanted to hear your thoughts.
So that idea of settling, thank you for that. The idea of settling Jews on land was very, how should I put it, enticing to Russian rulers, like Catherine II, 18th century. They was like, what do we do with all these Jews? Like when they started dividing Poland and Jews came from, well, let's put them somewhere. So she started this agricultural settlements of Jews in Crimea. And the idea was that that's where they'll become normal people, so they will be on their land. By the way, our friend Leon Trotsky, who was famous, he comes from a family of those old agricultural Jewish settlers. Soviets tried it too. In 1920s, they did Crimea and they did some areas of Ukraine. They got so much support from the United States. Joint Distribution Committee in America was funding this stuff like there is no tomorrow, like sending money. And David Ben-Gurion was complaining how if only 10% of what the United States is sending to Soviets to start those agricultural settlements, we would have established State of Israel 20 years earlier. Again, not to parallel, but all this complaining about where the resources should be going, it's also not new. And then the problem happened. So they were building all this stuff in Ukraine and in Crimea. And the local population didn't want any Jews there. They were experiencing so much violence. Like there was not enough militia in the world to guard them. And there was a lot of resentment because Jews were getting all these tractors from America. And Soviet agricultural thing was a horse and a wagon. And Jews were getting threshers and mowers and tractors. There's even a Yiddish song about all these threshers and mowers and tractors called Jan Koya. They're like glorifying all these machines and stuff for that. So anyways, the Soviets was like, what do we do with them now? So because that's not working and Americans want Jewish autonomy. So then somebody came up with the idea of Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan is located in the far east part of the Soviet Union, the Chinese border. And they said, well, Jews are so loyal to Soviets, we're going to put them on this problematic border with China, and maybe they will help to make that border stronger. And that is how Birobidzhan started, that settlement there. The problems were several. For example, Birobidzhan nature, it's all like trees and also a very unfertile land. So the whole agricultural thing was out of question, fine. So no need for tractors. So let's build cities. The cities were also hard to build because there are all these mosquitoes. And I don't know how familiar you're here in California with black flies and all this. They're like terrible. Like it was so bad that people usually lasted in Birobidzhan for a few months before they went away. Like I think the numbers are something like 40 or 50,000 Americans also went to build the Jewish life in Birobidzhan, and most of them came back, and those of them who did not come back were arrested by the Soviet government in 1937 for being spies. There's a new English translation of Shifra Lipschitz, a woman who went to build that Soviet life in Birobidzhan and was arrested for that, went to Gulag, and that's where she survived the war. Then Okay, so Birobidzhan was Jewish in the name only, but they did a lot of things. Yiddish is a mother tongue, and all, and there's a Shalom Aleichem Street, and there's all that stuff. But there were very few Jews always living there. During the war, interestingly, they did not allow Jews to come to Birobidzhan. When they put all these peoples to Central Asia, to Siberia, to Ural Mountains, Birobidzhan was off limits. And it had something to do with that border again, but again, Birobidzhan could not really help all these Jewish kids and the orphans who would have benefited from this. And then after the war, they started harassing Birobidzhan remaining Yiddish people too. They closed the Yiddish theater. They had a museum. They also shut the Jewish part down. So Birobidzhan was not spared in all the attacks on Jewish public life and culture. But then it became really important as a source of rumors, because when all the harassments of Jews were happening, artists, journalists, and all this called Cosmopolitans and not true Soviet citizens, and the rumors of arrests and doctors' plot, the main rumor was that Stalin will deport all Jews to Birobidzhan. And we have so many stories of how somebody saw those trains ready to pick up all the Jews and to send them to Birobidzhan. And that was a story that was totally believable, because remember, in 1944, they took all the Tatars and sent them away from where they lived in Crimea. They took people from Baltic states and sent them away too. They took all these Koreans from Ukraine and sent them to Kazakhstan. Like, there is no, there's no doubt in people's mind that Jews will be next, because this is how it all started. But, Stalin died, and historians until today did not find a single evidence that actually the plans for deportations existed. They looked and looked and looked, but there is no evidence that it was. But it doesn't matter, because the rumors of deportation to Birobidzhan were even scarier than had these plans ever existed, because it motivated people to do or not to do certain things. So Birobidzhan exists until today, still Yiddish one of the national languages, and they even started Yiddish Zoomer program, like summer program to teach Yiddish, because, who doesn't want to go to Siberia and with mosquitoes and learn a little Yiddish? And of course, there are no Jews involved. Like Chabad, I think, built something there, so maybe there's...
So we just have a couple more minutes. So Alex, you can go ahead and stop recording, so I know you have to break down the camera equipment before 1 o'clock.